Jess Starwood, who is a forager, plant-based chef, and herbalist with a Master's of Science degree in herbal medicine from the American College of Healthcare Sciences. She teaches wild food and herbalism classes in the greater Los Angeles area for adults as well as children and public school and homeschool groups. She hosts monthly wild food tasting events featuring her latest culinary creations and has worked with several Michelin-starred restaurants in Los Angeles. In December of 2019, Jess was recognized as one of the most creative chefs in Ventura County by Edible magazine. And you have a book called Mushroom Wonderland, A Forager's Guide to Finding, Identifying, and Using 25 Wild Fungi, which will be available in 2021, so next year. Looking forward to that one. Welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So how did you get started in the whole fungi world?
Well, it all kind of started with my interest in food. And about 10 years ago or so, I just became more curious about where my food came from and its impact on our health and how we can, fine tune our health or reverse certain issues through food. And so diving into that in kind of a personal journey, I studied herbs, I studied nutrition, and then the mushrooms just started, as people say, they just started talking to me. I ended up focusing more on them through my master's program and, researching their medicinal properties, their nutritional properties. And then I got interested in, well, where can I find them? And they're out there in the wild and I can just go find them myself. And that took me even further into my journey of, self exploration and, who I am and what my place is in nature.
Do you have a favorite variety or species?
I think it changes with the seasons.
Okay.
It's kind of whatever's on my, well, not whatever's on my plate, but, in the springtime, I'm all about morels, and then here in the winter, it's, we have, our giant chanterelles. I just love those. The lion's mane mushroom is always a delight to find as well.
And so then the foraging, you talked a little bit about that. What was it like the first time you went out? Did you go with somebody or did you read something about it and just decide to go out by yourself?
I took a few classes at the beginning, but it was really, I remember finding my very first edible plant and which was nettle. And it was kind of funny because I would see a plant that the leaf looked similar, and so I would touch it. I'm like, is that nettle? So yeah. I'm like, guess not, because it didn't,
No.
So there I was out in, by myself in the forest, just like touching. Like, oh, and then finally I found it. I'm like, ow, but I found it. It was so exciting.
Yes, hopefully there's some jewel weed next to it to help you take out the...
Not out here on the West Coast, but it was like this happy pain.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So talk to us a little bit about van life. So, you shared a few pictures, which I'll pull up, but you talk about kind of like living out in the wilderness a bit.
Yeah, about 5 years ago, after my divorce, I had never really traveled before. And all that I was left with after the divorce was my car. It was a Subaru Forester. And I was like, you know what? I don't have a van yet. I want to go travel. I want to go do things. And so I was like, okay, well, let's just make this work. And I traveled all over the West Coast, all the Western states, just pretty much in my little Subaru. I had it all outfitted for, sleeping and foraging. I would bring boxes and processing equipment with me in my Subaru, and it was a tight fit. But I was so passionate about what I was doing that I had no other choice. It was like, okay, well, I'm going to make this work. And then just this year, I finally was able to upgrade to a real van, which is great and has a lot more space, and my kids can go with me, and um, it's been amazing.
Yeah, you've got some pictures here of the van. Those are, well, is that ferns drying and then some other wild edibles?
That is Osha leaf.
Okay.
Osha is a plant, a medicinal plant from the Rocky Mountains that I collect every year. And it was so nice to have the space to dry everything right there in the van while I was out there this year. And alongside it is fireweed.
Okay.
So, yeah, I go out there specifically for some of those. And also, it's mushroom season as well. But this year it was so dry. I was so happy to be able to bring back something.
So coolers too, obviously. How long do you go foraging at a time?
Well, before I got the van, I had a Yeti cooler, which it would work pretty well. I could go for about 10 days, and stuff would make it back. But I would plan it to where if I was bringing back mushrooms, it would be later in my trip to where they would hopefully make it back. It was difficult coming back from Colorado a couple years ago with just tons of porcini. And by the time I drove back after 14 hours, most of them had all turned to mush.
Ooh.
Yeah. So I have since learned to either process and dehydrate them while I'm out on the road, or and in my van now I have a solar powered refrigerator. So that has made a world of a difference.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so this is the original vehicle?
Yeah, the original adventure vehicle. Yeah, that was probably one of my favorite adventures. This was in the Rocky Mountains, just outside of Telluride. And that night I was visited by a bear. Must have smelled my porcini that I was cooking that night for dinner over the campfire. And yeah, he was totally tried to get in, but yeah, he didn't make it.
Those Subarus are pretty tough.
Yeah, for sure. But it definitely startled me because I always travel alone, and that was it.
Yeah,
braver every time.
Yeah. My first car was a Subaru Outback Sport, little Impreza.
Nice.
Yeah, I bought it off a 85-year-old gentleman who just couldn't drive anymore and it had so low miles on it.
Perfect.
And these are morels, right?
Yes, these are burn morels, so they're found after a forest fire.
Okay. And for how many years after a forest fire? Is it just the year after, or?
Usually they're best the first year after, and then every following spring they'll come back, but less and less each year.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Very cool. And this is a wide range of there's a couple different varieties here. Do you want to talk about this?
Well, these are kind of some of the main mushrooms that we find here in Southern California. It's pretty dry. We have a really short mushroom season, but there are mushrooms to forage. And here we have on the bottom is the turkey tail mushroom. It's a medicinal mushroom. I love that one, and grows pretty abundantly. And then the purple ones are called bluets, and they're an edible mushroom. Not one of my favorites, but some people really do enjoy them. Then we have oyster mushrooms up towards the top over there, and those in some areas are really prolific here. And I know that oyster mushrooms aren't everyone's favorite, but I do enjoy them quite a bit, and they're pretty versatile. Then we have the smaller little gray ones there are called split gill mushrooms.
These
And
right here?
nope, to the far, yes, there we go.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. Those other ones were smaller, more immature oyster mushrooms.
That's what I thought, but I wasn't quite sure. Yeah, okay.
So these ones over here, the split gill mushrooms, are considered a medicinal mushroom as well. And in many other countries other than the United States, it's actually a very commonly eaten mushroom. They're a little bit tough, but cooked up, I've made them into jerky, and they're super tasty.
Okay.
And yeah, so it's one of those ones where, as a forager, you're thinking about, well, what can we use here? Even though we don't necessarily have, morels and these abundance of other mushrooms that you find everywhere else. We don't have lobsters, we don't have um, the so many other great things that other places have, but there are things to work with. So that's kind of one of the things I teach in my classes, is that having that forager's mindset of working with what you've got.
Absolutely. And this is staged really well. I love how you got the front in focus, and then you've got, is that chive blossoms or is that clover in the background?
Yeah, that's red clover. So this is a little sample of some things that I foraged up in the Rocky Mountains a couple of years ago. These are the rubriceps porcini. So they're the Rocky Mountain porcini. And then the hawkswing mushroom, the osha leaf, they're on the right-hand side, and some wild strawberries and dandelion.
Okay.
So a lot of times when I'm out traveling, I will, go out for the day and forage and collect things while I'm exploring, and bring back what I found to create a dish. And working with that location at that time, that's the flavor, that's the taste of that day in that place. And similar here, this is the Pacific Northwest this year. There were some chanterelles and an assorted amount of wild berries, from salmon berries, blackberries, and huckleberries, thimbleberries, and then all sorts of greens from, the oxalis, and I believe that was a type of, oh my goodness, my mind is just going blank for a second.
Well, there's so many wild plants out there.
I know. Well, and that's the thing. It's like learning so many different ones in different areas, and they're called different things sometimes. And each region, because the plant here on the right side, I know it's in the Claytonia genus of plants, but I'm forgetting what the common name that they use up there.
Yeah. So talk to us a little bit about that. Is that the regional adaptability of the mushrooms, and like your foraging on the West Coast is completely different than the East Coast?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I finally had the opportunity this year, while I was writing my book, to visit the East Coast, and I was amazed at all the mushrooms out there. And I'm like, oh, I thought I knew something about mushrooms.
Yeah.
Like, wow, I haven't ever seen these species before. It's like, I know this is a bolete, but I've never seen this particular species before. So it was really fascinating to see different regions, specific species. Like the Rocky Mountains have their own species of certain mushrooms that they look like something on the West Coast or the East Coast, but they're their own species. So I found that really fascinating.
So with that, what on the East, when you visited the East Coast, what was your favorite area to forage, or where would you find your best finds?
Let's see. I would say that my favorite part was up in Maine during July. It was it was wonderful. I found pretty much everything that I needed to find out there in the first day I was there,
Nice.
and it was pretty magical. And I got to eat so many new things. It was great. These are some oyster mushrooms and some chickweed that was growing nearby them. Um, this was from this was this summer in Arizona, and I actually grew up in Arizona, in the Phoenix area,
Okay.
and it was only recently that I realized that Arizona is actually a really great place for mushroom hunting. And living in California is like, oh, it's all about the West Coast, the Pacific
Uh-huh.
Northwest, and then I'm like, why would I go to Arizona for mushrooms? That can't possibly be a thing. And I mean, this was just a little photo I did just for a lunch one day. I saw these and cooked them up for my mom and my daughters who were traveling with me at
Uh-huh.
that time, and it was it was awesome. It was just amazing to see that, just the diversity in different areas that you wouldn't even think um, would be so abundant.
Yeah. I mean, Arizona, you think of it a hot, dry climate, so you do not really
Totally.
think of the mushrooms. But are there specific areas that are more have more moisture?
Well, definitely in the areas, the mountain areas for sure.
Okay.
During the monsoon season, there's summer storms that they get. And some years obviously are going to be better than others, but uh, yeah, up higher elevations for sure, you're going to get more variety and diversity. But even in the desert at my parents' place, they live just outside of Phoenix, and I've found things in their yard that totally surprised me, like puffballs. I'm like, oh, well, look at
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. 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 I've been to the Phoenix a few times.
Mhm.
So what is this?
This is a sculpted puffball, and it's a puffball. It's an edible, but this one is pretty unique looking. It has these normally kind of pyramid shaped little spines on it.
Yeah.
And this one's a little bit older, so they've kind of collapsed a bit, but it was pretty fascinating. And, you know, photographing mushrooms, it's all about getting down in the dirt and
Yeah.
getting up close and personal with them.
Yeah. Exactly. You gotta like really, yes, lay out sometimes, or yeah, get down in there. All right. So what's going on here?
Oh,
Oh, well, these are oyster mushrooms, and that's as I mentioned before, they're kind of one of our more common mushrooms here in Southern California, and
and we'll see.
um,
We'll see.
it's always fun to go mushroom hunting with friends and being
Uh-huh.
silly and
Yes. Yes. I'm trying to caption this, and I'm like, oh my gosh, another oyster mushroom, or I don't know.
at this particular adventure, it was definitely getting pretty ridiculous. Where I'm like, how can we fashion more bags out of what
Yeah.
fabric we have with us? And it's like,
Yes.
Hello, 1 second.
Yeah.
Ajay,
Yeah.
1
And
second.
well, I mean, talk about that
1 second.
aspect of things where sometimes you'll probably go out forage and there's very little, and other times it's just like unbelievable bounty. So talk about that.
for sure. It seems that sometimes if I bring a basket and have high expectations, there won't be anything.
Okay. So it's like praying for rain or leaving your car windows open so that you'll get
Totally.
the. Yeah.
So sometimes I'm like, you know what? I'm just gonna leave my basket, leave my bags, and then I'll, come across like the mother load.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it does seem to happen that way. I'm like, oh, I'm just gonna go for a quick little walk, and then next thing I'm like, how am I? I can't even like carry these things home.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Now, another thing too with mushrooms and with the work you do, it seems you're blending a lot of different flavors. And in this picture, I mean, you've got, I believe that's purslane. You've got a couple different types of mushrooms. Um, What other thing? You got some? Is that pickled red cabbage?
Those are actually fermented yucca flowers.
Oh,
And so I fermented those with red cabbage, which gave them their color because they're normally white.
yeah.
But, you know, I do have an art background. So whenever I'm creating dishes or working on a menu, I'm always thinking about colors and textures and contrasts and, how to bring things together in a very appealing and interesting and unique way. Yeah.
What's this at the center right here?
Those are mushroom stems that have been pickled. I believe those are what were those? Those were Amanita calyptoderma, the spring cacora mushrooms.
Okay, okay. And then when you pickled those, did you do anything special with them, or just in a straight vinegar? Or
Let's see. This has been a little while, but I likely put lots of spices in it. Good question.
Okay, that's totally fine. And then you do these monthly dinners with all of this. So talk to us about that.
Yeah. So these dinners they take a lot of work. So I have foraged pretty much everything that goes on the plate. Everything is plant-based and free of anything processed or unnatural.
Yep.
So it's a very unique meal, and
Yes.
generally from 10 to 8 to 10, I say 8 to 12 courses I've done. So each dish will some of them I have done it where each dish represents a different bioregion, or where we go from the ocean to the mountains.
Yeah.
And so it's highlighting flavors and textures from each area as you go through the dinner. Some have also focused on different parts of the body. So each dish is like focusing on a different, body system, whether it's, gut health or skin health or cardiovascular health. And so it kind of takes more of an herbal approach to the meal. So I like to tell a story through these ingredients, and obviously these are all ingredients that have been foraged in the area around where the event takes place. So it's you're eating from the land where you're at, rather than when you go to a regular restaurant, you're eating foods that came from all over different parts of the world, and you just lose connection with your environment and your food, and which is yourself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting to think about if we are where we eat, and that the food in your local area is the food that you're supposed to be eating. If we're flying in food from around the world, no wonder the problems we have, the challenges we have, the health problems we have.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It totally throws our body off. We don't. Our body doesn't know what to do with these foods that have been altered, that have been grown in other environments. Those foods have been adapted to other climates, other regions, and then when we put those into our body, there's just this energetic difference that I feel throws a lot of people off. And people are like, I can't feel connected anymore. I'm just all scattered. And it's like, well, yeah, well, you're eating food from everywhere else besides where you're at. And so I feel like it's a way to ground a person in where they are. Yes, another rendition of a walk. This was a local area that I go to often, and this is what springtime looks like here. These giant leaves are miner's lettuce, and
Claytonia?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah,
I thought so. They're just so giant.
They are. I came across these as I was walking, and I was like, "Oh my goodness, those are taco shells,
Yeah.
like wild taco shells." And that gave me the inspiration for what I put together. And so I continued to collect all these other ingredients. And actually, the mushrooms here were the bluets that grow in my front yard here.
Okay. And
Mm.
I'm seeing probably a brassica flower there. Is that Cherville? Some
Yes.
chickweed, arugula flower?
I believe that's a wild radish flower, actually.
Okay, so same family. Yes.
Yes.
And then what other the more like almost like tiny green beans?
Those are actually the first leaves of the Claytonia.
Oh,
They have these
yes.
long, skinny, um, forget the botanical term, but it's the first leaves.
Yeah,
And
cotyledons.
yes, there you go.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, that's just
So
visually stunning, and just
yeah, so that's also the part of what I do is bringing in all those creative elements, even though it's the same plant. That's different than what you would buy at the supermarket. It's like, oh, you can't buy these things.
no, no, you absolutely can't.
This here is another area that I like to go to. This is let's see, I think that was probably April. This was April in Thousand Oaks, the city I live in. And here we have, these are our chanterelles. These guys get humongous here, and they are so much fun. So this was a creamy mushroom soup, chanterelle mushroom soup, pretty much blended. I do everything plant based, so I don't use any cream or dairy. So if I'm lucky enough, I'll use acorn or pine nuts, which are our local, fatty
Mhm.
nuts. But otherwise, I use cashew. Um, and then I did a nettle and mallow green sauce on top, which was
Yeah,
pretty tasty.
yeah. And the mallow is what's the leaf in the middle of the photo.
Yes. Hmm.
Okay, and then yeah, she kind of like blended it and then made it as like an ink on top of the soup, which is really cool.
Yeah, it gives it that visual interest, and
Yeah.
breaks up the mushroom soup. Cream of mushroom soup isn't the prettiest thing to look at, so I'm always trying to dress things up a bit.
Yes. Yes, I get that. All right, now this was very cool. I love the wild cucumber shell. Talk to us about this a
Yes.
bit.
Yeah, this was another kind of crazy idea. I was out for a walk and I saw these wild cucumber shells that were just hanging around on the bushes, and I was like, wow, those are so interesting. But a couple nights before, I had just been to a well-known Japanese restaurant where they served uni,
Uh huh.
sea urchin, and I was like, interesting how these two look so similar
Yeah.
in their shape. And as I said, I do everything plant-based. I was like, now I wonder if I could pull off a plant-based
Yeah.
sea urchin. So here the sauce is a nettle sauce, nettle and seaweed sauce.
Okay.
So it does have kind of a sea flavor to it. On top is a fermented lobster mushroom with pickled mustard seeds and garnished with watercress. So it
Okay.
definitely had a ocean theme, but
Yeah.
using all ingredients from the land, minus the seaweed.
So, what type of seaweed do you like to use?
I go up north to Northern California, and I like to use sea lettuce and kelp and wakame.
Hmm.
So I'm still learning a little bit more about seaweeds because they're a really interesting sustainable source of wild foods, and
Yeah.
so that's kind of an area I'm wanting to learn more about.
Hmm. Hmm. And this looks like a meal in the wild.
Yes, this was the dish I made that attracted the little black bear that visited me in Colorado.
Okay.
So that day, I collected lots of porcini, which is there in the center. I always have sweet potatoes. I bring with sweet potatoes and avocados are kind of my staple. That
Yep.
are things that go with me.
Yeah.
And then I kind of add on whatever wild things I find. So I believe those were some a mix of wild greens that I had found, probably lots of dandelion, um, and then the porcini on top was so
Yeah.
delightful, and that view that was in the background. That's actually snow or
Okay.
such. Yeah, so it was beautiful to sit there eating my porcini dinner, watching the sunset, all alone in the mountains, and then
Yeah. Not knowing a bear was coming in a 4 hours to visit you.
right. Oh yeah, yeah. Luckily, it was a full moon, and I could see him so clearly that night. It was
Yeah.
quite a memorable dinner.
Do you have a favorite sweet potato variety?
Mm, let's see. I do like the Japanese sweet potatoes and the purple sweet potatoes.
Hmm.
Um, but I know there's probably lots of heirloom potatoes out there that I haven't had the opportunity to try yet.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it's again, it's one of those wild and wonderful worlds. If you decide to go down that rabbit hole, you can really go down it.
Well, you have my interest now. I'm like, oh, right. I could be looking into more sweet potato.
Yeah, so actually, a nonprofit farm that I helped found in upstate New York, the first year they grew, it's a 100-acre field, and it was all sand. I mean, just almost
Mm,
pure sand for the field. And so they're like, well, what will grow well is sweet potatoes. And so they did a pretty large section, like 8 or 10 varieties. And so it was fascinating taking them all
wow.
home, curing them all, lining them up, and then doing this massive taste test.
Mm,
And it was really cool. I mean, eventually we got to the point like we couldn't tell any longer. We just gave up. But the white sweet potatoes, they are very unique. They're very cool.
hmm
So
Absolutely. Oh, this one was a very celebratory meal that I just had actually about a week and a half ago in
okay,
Massachusetts. Um, for my book, I had to photograph 25 of the top, interesting mushrooms to be found in North America. And on the West Coast, I could pretty much find all of them except one, which is the hen of the woods, the Grifola frondosa
yes,
mushroom, and it only grows on the East Coast. So that is the one mushroom that prompted me to go out to Maine in July. And I knew I was a little bit too early, but it was
yeah,
perfect timing for everything else. And this was this was the mushroom that I came all the way back for uh, just recently, and
yeah,
ended up in Massachusetts, and there it was. I found it and made a pretty simple meal, but it was like
uh-huh.
the taste of success, and the grand
Yes,
finale of my book. And I had stopped at a farm stand not uh, too much earlier than this, and made they had a little dehydrated soup packet, or starter mix,
yeah,
and must have been from whatever excess they had on the farm that didn't sell or whatever. And I was like, this is so perfect. I can just make a super simple
yeah.
meal, and I enjoyed probably one of the best sunsets I've seen in a very long time. And it was nice, chilly fall evening, so
Yeah.
it was amazing.
Is that a kale I see in the top part of that bowl? Okay.
Yeah, I had also at the farm stand. I also grabbed a bunch of kale too, which was perfect.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
great. I don't know if it was the taste of success,
Yeah.
or it was just that was it just worked well. Sometimes simple, especially when you're on the road and traveling it's sometimes the simple things that make things amazing.
Talk to us about someone who wants to start foraging. They get super excited by this talk. They're like, "Oh my gosh, this is amazing!" And they go out and they don't see any, like I did earlier this spring. And I think I could have been in the wrong area. But give us a few tips for that person who's looking to go out and start foraging.
Well, I think that the first step really is just to be outside, just to start learning patterns in weather, learning the seasons, because a lot of times people who are just starting out foraging, may still be like disconnected with the season and be like, oh, it's August in Southern California. I want to go hunt mushrooms. I'll get people
Yeah,
asking me to take them out, and I'm like, there's no rain. Like, we need
yeah,
rain. It's hot and dry. That's not going to happen.
yeah,
So, but just paying attention. Learning where where the water is, where water would be if it rained. Where's it going to collect? Where's
yeah,
north side of the mountain? you know, um, just learning different tree species, because that's going to be a really big key to finding, your mycorrhizal species.
yeah,
So tree identification is a good place to start, especially if you're not finding anything right away. I know it can be a little discouraging, but um, trying to learn like what an oak tree looks like, what the different conifers are, because that'll at least help give you a good direction to start going into.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. I talked to Tim. We did an interview with Tim, and he basically does wild, well, cultivated, but in the woods, a lot of oysters
hmm,
and the shiitakes. But then he also forages for the maitakes. And he was talking to me about how he literally has his 100 maitake trees in
hmm.
his area that he goes to. And then he was talking about how they like to be on the oak, and it's usually the oak that have some dead limbs, but not all dead. So it's fascinating just how unique that mushroom likes for where they yield well.
Right, and if you see one, it's going to come back the next year. So over the years, I mean, it takes many years to become a good forager and mushroom hunter for sure. It's like, you start having this like mental map of where all your trees are, and
Yeah,
um,
don't write that down.
no, it's just all in here, and I'm like, oh, I gotta go check that one and that one and that one, and I know the city by where my trees are.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So another thing too is there are poisonous species. So how do you recommend someone make sure that they do not ingest something toxic?
Yeah, that's definitely a really important thing to be aware of, especially when you start foraging. Luckily, some of the more popular mushrooms to forage are not too difficult to mistake with a poisonous one.
Hmm.
Um, but definitely learning from an expert is really helpful. Going to classes, working with a teacher. ID books are great, but there's still room for error there. I hesitate to recommend using online forums, where such as like Facebook, where you can post a
Yeah,
picture of what you found. That's you're still putting your life in someone else's hands. But the more you're out there, the more you're looking at mushrooms, the more observant you are, the more you're looking through key books and
yeah,
keying out species, the more confident you will be.
yeah, yeah. And I'm sure there are poisonous mushrooms that can look like some of the edible ones. So maybe just stay away from those varieties to
Mhm.
start with.
Yeah, especially the Amanita category of mushrooms. It contains the most deadliest mushrooms that are out there, and there are edible ones that are very similar, but those are certainly not for beginners who are just starting to,
Mhm.
get into um, uh, eating mushrooms, even though it may be tempting to be like, oh wow, was so risky and ate this mushroom that looks just like a deadly one.
Yeah.
Um, I can see some people having the attraction to that, but it's definitely, you know, it's not something to mess around with.
Yeah. Now, how do you sell the mushrooms you forage? I mean, noticed that you were part of a CSA that was doing some stuff with mushrooms for a while. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, what kind of started that was, as I was getting better at mushroom hunting, I would come back with really large amounts of mushrooms that I'm like, what am I going to do with all of these? I
Uh-huh.
can't possibly eat them all myself or, give them away. So I had a neighbor who lived across the street who has a little farm, and she's like, hey, well, I'm trying to sell some produce. And I'm like, well, maybe I could sell some mushrooms. So we kind of joined forces and put together a little program that, we were able to sell our specialties.
Very cool. And
Yeah.
then I'm assuming chefs are probably your top sales outlet otherwise because they're the ones looking for those unique species.
Before the pandemic, yes, I was working with several different chefs in LA, and and with one restaurant, I was foraging every week. I would just bring carloads of stuff
Yeah.
to them, and it was great. I was very busy, and
Yeah.
it took a lot of work, but yeah, after the pandemic, everybody kind of like scaled back, and then even I got sidetracked onto my book project, and
Yeah.
has me kind of rethinking a lot of things as well.
Talk to us a little bit about the book.
So my book is called Mushroom Wonderland, a forager's guide to finding the top 25 wild mushrooms. I believe I'm.
Okay.
The subtitle I think has changed many times, um, but it will be out next summer, I believe, and it's by Countryman Press. So it's going to have a lot of my photography in it,
Okay.
and kind of an introductory guide to kind of the most interesting mushrooms out there, featuring the top culinary ones, and then also touching a bit on medicinal mushrooms, and um, and then highlighting toxic mushrooms as well.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
because it's important to have something to look at to reference. Oh well, don't eat a death cap. Well, we need to know what a death cap
Yeah.
looks like.
Yeah.
Um,
But those mushrooms do not have a how to eat section.
no, they have their own section there. But yeah, it's going to talk a little bit about my journey into mushroom hunting and kind of the things I've learned. A few recipes. It's not a cookbook, but it does have how to prepare mushrooms and a few specifics on um, things to play with once you do find some mushrooms.
Mhm. Very cool. So where can people find out more about you and your work?
I am on Instagram at Jess.Starwood,
Mhm.
and also on my website at jstarwood.com.
Okay.
And I will be offering classes on foraging and mushrooms, and I also do a lot of um, traveling events as well. So those hopefully will return next year.
Okay.
So multi-day foraging adventures. We did one in Baja
Ooh.
last year. So it was a week-long foraging adventure. Like it was quite
Yeah.
an adventure.
That sounds like a blast. What time of year was that?
That was in November.
Okay. All right. All right. Yeah, for us veggie folks, we have to get through Thanksgiving and then we have a lot more free time. So
Yeah. Well, this was during Thanksgiving, so whoever could, get away
Yeah.
from family obligations, we all escaped to Mexico and ate well and swam in the ocean and waterfalls and hot springs. It was magical, but all around food and wild plants there.
Very cool. Well, Jess, thank you so much for your time. This has been a fascinating interview and just conversation about all things fungi and food. And thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.